Hey, what's up? Andrew Kramer here for VideoCopilot.net, and welcome back to another very exciting tutorial. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Fume FX inside of 3ds Max. It's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be, a blast. We're going to be creating some explosions, and hopefully create something like this. So we've got some nice smoke. And here's just a couple of other ideas. Some early tests. And a lens flare. Optical flares. Check it out. Okay, so we're going to be using Fume FX. And we're going to talk about how to set it up. And some of the key features to focus in on. And, it's going to be a lot of fun. So let's go ahead and get started. First thing that we need to do with Fume FX is create a fuel source. So what is burning? What we're going to do is hit 6. And this is going to open up particle flow. Now, this comes with 3ds Max, and we're going to choose New Standard Flow. So this is going to be a basic particle system. So let's just change the color here. And we can scrub through time, and we can just see some particles coming out. Let's go ahead and make some changes. We're going to delete the cube shape mode, and we're going to delete the rotation. So select and delete. Then if we click on the speed, we're going to make a few changes here. Let's set the speed to 400 centimeters. Now, I have it set up with centimeters. If you go to customize unit setup, you can change it to centimeters here. So that way your settings will match mine. I'm also going to set the divergence to 90. So if I crank that up, you can see it just kind of spreads out almost like a circle. So we'll set it to 90, and then we'll reverse it so that it's pointed upwards. Then we'll go to the birth and set the emit stop to 30. So right now, the particles just continue to shoot out. But like an explosion, we want it to be one burst of energy. So we'll change that to frame 1. So all 200 particles are going to come out on frame 1. And in fact, we're going to make it 500. Some people like to double the fun. I go above and beyond. We've got our basic particle source. Maybe add a little bit of variation to the speed. Now, one other quick thing we need to do is delete the particles over time. So if we take a delete node, put it under the speed, we can delete the particles by age, and we'll set that age to 7 frames and a variation of 3. So you can see now the particles just sort of die out. The idea here is we want to create the initial fuel for the explosion. Fume FX actually takes that initial burst of energy and then generates all of the fluid smoke and the burning and all that stuff. So we just need to create the catalyst for that simulation. So we'll come back here, we'll close this down, and we'll get rid of this physics bar. And let's come over here to the helpers, and we'll go down to Fume FX. So because we're using a particle source, we need to create a particle source helper. So we'll click in here, and what this will allow us to do, if we click on the Modify tab, is add the particle flow into the source. So we'll click on this pick object, click on the particle source, we've added it, and we're good to go. Now, one thing we need to do is set the radius of the fuel particle. So each particle is now a fuel source. So what we want to do is set the radius up a bit. So what we want to try to do is get these little circles, the fuel radius sizes, to almost overlap, but not too much. So that looks pretty good. And then we want to animate them over time. So if we click on this little graph, it allows us to animate the size over time. So if we set the N value to 0, we can then adjust this editor, this graph editor, and just make it a little bit more dramatic. So it's going to be on and then off kind of quickly. So, and then out. And I think that's it. We basically want to create that initial energy and then allow Fume FX to do its magic. And let me tell you something. It's been used in movies that actually have magic. All right, so let's come over here to the Create, and we'll go down to Fume FX, and we'll click on the Fume FX object, and what we want to do is click inside of here and draw a box around our explosion area. So we want it to be a little bit taller so that our explosion and smoke can rise up. This is basically our simulation area. So let's go and click on it, and we'll go to the Modify tab. And then we're going to open up the Fume FX UI. So this is where we're going to change all the settings and rendering and simulation controls. We can also open up our preview, which will show us kind of what things are looking like. and this green button will run the simulation. So the first thing we need to do is input our fuel type. So we'll come over here to the object source, and we're going to pick our particle helper that we set up earlier. So we'll come over here to the General tab, and let's just click on the Simulate. Let's just see what the default settings are going to be. All right, so they look amazing. We've got this little puff of smoke. Now, whatever viewport you have selected is what the preview will render. So you can see here we've got the little bit of fire, and then we've got some smoke that rises up. All right, so it's not quite ILM quality, but with a little bit of work, maybe we can get it to ILM quality from 1980. So let's come over here to the Simulation tab. There's a couple of things that we need to set up initially. First of all, we have a thing called spacing in the simulation area. This has a lot to do with the resolution and quality of your simulation. Now, right now it's set to 9 centimeters, but if we lower the value, say 2.5, the simulation will be slower, but it'll be more detailed. So let's go ahead and simulate that and see what it looks like. So we can see a lot more detail, but the simulation is much slower. Now, if we look at the end here, you can see the difference. The problem with the spacing, it actually changes the entire look of the simulation. It actually affects the entire simulation. So you want to try to get this as close to final output. Otherwise, if you change it later, your entire simulation will change as well. So let's try to get this down maybe to 2. And even though things will be a little bit slower, it'll be a lot closer to the quality that we're looking for. Now let's come over here to the Simulation tab. This is where we're going to set up the look, the control, the fuel, all that good stuff. First things first, let's set the maximum iterations down to about 80. And this is going to speed up our simulation a little bit. And then we have another control called time scale. Now this is a little bit more tricky of a control to explain, but it's not like time remapping or speeding up your explosion. It's not just going to make this faster. It's actually more like a global multiplier for all of the settings. So if we turn this up to say 2, things are going to look a lot different. I want to turn on the blocking side. So we go to the Z here, change it to -Z. And what this will do is allow the simulation to interact with the ground. So right now, everything seems to be floating. But when you turn that on, it's actually going to kind of feel like it's coming off of the ground surface. You can see here it kind of interacts with the ground and looks a lot more realistic. Okay, let's go and start working on the look of this explosion. First thing I'm going to do is come over to the Rendering tab, and we're going to come down here to Smoke. And I want to change the color. So I'm going to right click, change it to keyless mode, and then just change it to gray. So we're going to get into the rendering settings a little bit later on, but I just want to change the color so that we can see the fire a little bit better. So come over here to the Simulation tab, and let's talk about some of the settings. First thing that comes to mind is burn rate. Right now, the fire kind of burns out instantly, just and it's gone. If we turn the burn rate down to like 10, our fire is going to linger a lot longer during the simulation. So now you can see the fire fades out a little bit more over time. But I want to actually keyframe this value. So what we're going to do is go to frame 8 or so, and I'm going to set an auto key, and we're going to set this to, I don't know, 15, maybe 16. And then we're going to move forward just a couple of frames and turn it down to 2.2. We basically want it to slowly burn. So initially, it's going to have a large burst of energy. Let me show track view and delete that first keyframe. So we want our initial blast to burn really fast and then slowly burn over time. Now, another problem is our explosion is rising up too high, too fast. So what we're going to do is we're going to come down here to the temperature. The temperature controls both the fire and the smoke together. So we're actually just going to lower this value down to about 0.2. So I want you to see what that does and the change with the animated burn rate. And let's just take a look at our simulation. All right, I'll go ahead and hit stop. And keep in mind, when you hit stop, just go ahead and let the box close and the simulation to finish before you start moving on so that you don't, I don't know, blow up your computer in an unintended way. So here we've got the simulation. You can see it doesn't rise as fast. The fire sort of lingers a bit. I might even lower that burn rate down even more, maybe down to 1.8 and move it a little bit closer so that we can get some nice fire later on into the simulation. All right, so this is looking pretty good, but we want to go ahead and make a few more changes. So one of the things we have is this expansion control. And what this does is allow the ignition to be larger. So you can see I've got like these little round bubbles. Well, if I turn the expansion up, those are going to get larger and then combine with each other as they get close to each other. And the other thing here is this fire creates smoke. So look, we've got a little bit of smoke here, right? But if I click on our particle helper, I can scroll down and we see we have our fuel, we have our temperature, and we have our smoke. But I'm actually going to disable this. I'm going to click on it and choose disabled. And then we're going to go back. So now we're not going to be rendering any more smoke until I turn on the option in the simulate fuel until we turn on the fire creates smoke option. So we turn that on and we'll set the smoke density to like 16. And we want it to be temperature based. So we turn that on. Let's set the temperature to like 45. The cool thing about it is that the smoke will be generated from the fire. Just gives us a little bit better control over how much smoke we create. Now, another thing I'd like to do is I want to go back to our particle source and I want to turn up the particle amount. So right now we have 500. I'm going to set that to 750 because I want this explosion to have more detail and I feel like we just need to fill it in a little bit more. Now, if I come down here, I want to talk about the turbulence noise. So explosions aren't supposed to be smooth and fluid. They're supposed to be more, violent and energetic. So we're going to add some turbulence. So we have our turbulent noise map. What I want to do is set this down to 8, which is going to be really small, and the detail up to 5. Then we have our turbulence. So we can set this up to like 4, and let's run the simulation. All right, so I only simulated a few frames, but you can see things are just getting way too crazy, way too fast. So I want to keyframe the turbulence so that it's not on the whole time. So we're actually going to keyframe it from the very beginning here. And we'll turn on auto key, set a keyframe here, and then move forward just a couple of frames, and then we're going to turn it down to 0. So we want it to just go away completely and then allow our smoke to rise over time. Now, for this tutorial, I'm actually going to increase our spacing up to 3 so that our simulations will just be a little bit faster. Just keep in mind, once you lower this value down to get better quality, you're going to have to probably adjust some of your simulation settings. So let's take a look at this, and it should be a lot faster. All right, so I'll go ahead and hit stop, and we can take a look. So starting to look a lot better. I'm thinking maybe our turbulence is still a little too high. Maybe we should just start it a little bit earlier. And so I just moved those 2 keyframes over so that they'll fade out a little bit sooner. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. But there's a couple of controls that are going to really shape the way this looks and shape the way the smoke is generated. And that's the Vorticity and the Advection stride. So 2 very odd sounding options are going to be pretty important here. So let's do a couple of tests here. Let's turn the Vorticity down to 0. And we'll turn up the Advection stride up to like 0.75. And let's run the sim. All right, so I'll just stop it there. So you can see we have a very puffy looking smoke simulation. And it doesn't look very realistic, doesn't look very large. And that's because we turned the Vorticity down so much. So what we want to do is turn this value up. And what this will do is create more of that billowing of the smoke. So if we look closely here, we can see, like in this area here, we see like the smoke kind of rolls. And that's kind of the idea behind the Vorticity. But it's majorly influenced by the Advection stride amount. But let's just go ahead and lower it down to maybe 0.55 and let's run the sim. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. Our smoke's moving. It's got a nice size to it. I would probably come down here to the fuel and maybe slow our burn rate down even more. Notice we have another option called burn rate variation. So if we turn that up to like 0.9, that'll make it so that all the fire doesn't burn out all at once. So it'll just give it a little bit more variation. I'm also going to turn up the expansion here to like 2.3 because I want this to really open up and be a large explosion. And I'm also going to turn up the heat production to 12. Another thing I may want to do is turn up our vorticity to 0.95. Let's just make a couple more adjustments here. Let's turn the Advection stride back to 0.6. And I want to bring the buoyancy down a touch, so 0.18. Since it feels like it's maybe rising up a little bit too fast. And then lastly, let's go back to the general and let's set our spacing back down to 1.5. So keep in mind, this is going to change our simulation quite a bit, but I think it'll start getting us towards more of a photorealistic finish. So let's go ahead and simulate. All right, so this is looking pretty good. Now we can keep playing with it and run some more simulations, but let's go and move on to some rendering tips since the preview is not exactly what this is going to look like in the end. All right, let's go and take a look at the rendering and shader settings. So we'll click on the rendering tab and we've got a couple of different options here. One thing we have here is the step size. So I'm going to set this up to 150 and the jittering up to about 25. And this is going to make the rendering a little bit faster. So a lower step size, and let's come down here to the fire. So right now it's just a color, but I'm going to right click, change it to key mode, which will give us a gradient, and then we'll click on it. And let's set the opacity to 2.2. And this is going to make the fire more, vivid, more intense. And let's right click and disable this graph. And this will just use the opacity from the color of the fire. So here, let's click in here and let's change this to black. And we can also bring the color intensity down. So if we just drop this a bit. Maybe a little bit more color. So we'll just saturate it a bit here. So that looks pretty nice. Now I'm going to click again here. And we'll set this first color to being a little bit more red. Okay, so that gradient looks pretty good, and we can also increase the color intensity to really make it look more hot, and I like that. So we'll close the gradient, and next we need to add some lights. So let's close this. Let's go over here to the create lights, and we'll click on standard, and we're going to grab a couple of target directional lights. So pull out here, and we'll come in here and just draw a light. Now I have a perspective view here. Let's go ahead and choose view, create camera from view. So we can see our camera is right here and our light is right here. So let's move our light a little bit over, and then let's set it up. So we'll go into the modify. Let's turn on shadows. We want them to be ray traced. And I set the color to like a light blue. And let's come over here to the shadow parameters and make sure atmosphere shadows is on. So that's our first light. And let's hold down shift and then drag another light over to the side here. Now for this light, I'm going to lower the intensity and change it to just like a tan or like a light warm color. And then we're going to hold down shift and make one more copy of the light. And we'll bring it down a bit here. Bring it over. And let's lower the intensity and maybe just make it a little less saturated. Okay. So basically we have three lights surrounding our simulation, and our blue light is right here. We'll back it up a bit. So then we'll go back into Fume, and we need to add the lights into our illumination tab. So we'll click on that, and then we'll just pick the three lights. Then in the rendering tab, let's make sure that our smoke is set to cast and receive shadows. So this will give us a pretty good looking setup. Let's see what our preview view is. So let's zoom in a bit. So have our camera. So let's go back to perspective view here. There we go. And let's go and hit render. Okay, not too bad. So let's take a look at a couple of things. So first of all, our rendering step size, maybe it's a little high. Let's set it to 100 to get rid of some of the artifacts. And let's set the jitter up to 50. Now for our illumination, we can also turn up the step size to maybe 200, which will help speed things up. But what we're going to take a look at is this multiple scattering option. So what this does is allows the light to bleed into the smoke and essentially illuminate the smoke. So let's turn that on. And we're going to set the maximum depth to 8 and the fall off to 7. So that'll just optimize our render a bit. Now I want to turn the smoke strength down to 0. But I want my fire to illuminate the smoke around it. So let's leave it at 1. Or actually, let's just turn it down to like 0.5. Let's render it and then I'll show you what it looks like without. Okay, so here's what it looks like with multiple scattering on. So I'll copy my viewport render there and then let's turn it off. And let's render it one more time. So you can see here it's illuminating the smoke in a really interesting and really realistic way. So we want to keep that on, and we might turn the strength down just a bit, 0.45. All right, so this is looking pretty good. And if I wanted to render it out, I could go to my render settings, set the range 0 to 60 or whatever I have, 70, and then set the output to a file format. I like to use OpenEXR. And you just click render, and then you'll get a render sequence of the explosion. Now, I've actually already rendered out a similar looking explosion, and we can take a look at what the raw frames look like. So it looks pretty cool. We've got some nice smoke rolling. And what I want to do is show you how you might color correct this to look a little bit more realistic. So let's create just a gray background and drop that in there. And then we're going to go ahead and color correct it. So what we'll do is we'll choose Effect, Hue and Saturation, and we'll go to the red channel here, and I want to just shift it over just a little bit and then bring the intensity down and the saturation up. Then we're going to go to the yellow channel, and I want to bring the saturation down, but the brightness up, or the lightness. So what that's going to do is just give us a little bit more of like a bright spot in our explosion. So we'll just shift this over so that we just get some, so we leave a little bit of the yellow, but we can brighten up part of the explosion. So I don't want to do it that much, but I just want you to be able to see that we're just isolating some of those yellow hues. Turn that back down there. All right, so there we have the initial color correction. Now back to the red channel, I might bring the lightness down just a touch so that it blends a little nicer. And then we're going to do some glow effect. So then we're going to create a new adjustment layer. And we'll choose Effect, Stylize, Glow, which is just outside of the frame. Sorry about that. And let's turn up the threshold a bit. And I want to set the glow operation to screen. And I want to change it to AB color. And we'll come down here. Let's set this to like an orange and then like a red-orange. So then we're going to increase the intensity and the radius. So there we have a little bit of glow going on. So let's duplicate the glow now. Control D or Edit, Duplicate. And let's increase the radius of this. So we're going to make it nice and wide and even lower the threshold so that our entire, in fact, let's put this one before, so let's put the wider glow before the tighter glow. And let's lower the intensity a bit. Down just a touch. And then we'll bring this one down too now that we've increased the intensity. And then let's add a little bit of color correction. So choose Effect, Color Correction, Some curves will be a nice touch here. A little bit of contrast. And there we have it. Pretty nice looking explosion. So let's preview this really quick. So we'll just hit playback. All right, not too shabby. So the glows definitely help give it a nice punch. I've also rendered out a separate explosion of the same explosion, but kind of coming up towards the camera. And, you know, the quality's not quite that good for this close-up of a view, but hey, you got the simulation done. You might as well render it from multiple angles because it's fun. All right, well, I hope you guys found this tutorial useful. My name is Andrew Kramer, and be sure to check out my website, videocopilot.net. We've got a lot of great tools for post-production artists like optical flares, as well as Element 3D, which is a 3D rendering tool for After Effects. And we've got some great tutorials on tons of different subjects, so check out the website. And be sure to check out the blog. We try to post project files and cool things as often as possible. Once again, thank you guys for watching, and we will see you next time.